Hello, you guys, Luxura Moon Goddess, and today we will be discussing mental time travel. So, let's get into it. So, mental time travel, what do I mean by this? I have found that you may not be able to time travel in the sense of, actually going back in time or going into the future. But you can mentally time travel using the power of reflecting on your memories. So, mental time travel. Sometimes I found with myself that I like to go back in time and mentally time travel back into a different period of my life. And so, this, in a sense, if you see my previous video about transmutation, this is an example of transmutation that I personally do. So, with that being said, how do I mentally time travel? With that, you can create a certain energy just by mentally time traveling, getting yourself in that energy, in that mood. For example, I was a child of the early 2000s, and so I like to reminisce with certain music, certain songs. The power of music is really powerful with mental time travel. We know that music affects the mind, music affects the body. It gives you energy, it raises your mood. It can make you happy, it may make you sad, although you shouldn't be listening to sad songs. But anyway, the power of music. So when I want to get into a certain mood, you can create your own playlist. It can be from the 2000s, it can be from the 90s, with that being said, music today really isn't, not that music today is not necessarily good, but we know that music, throughout the decades, each era really has something different. So I like to personally, most of the time, listen to songs from early 2000s, sometimes the 90s, sometimes even like the 80s. I just prefer listening to that music. And when I listen to certain songs, it really does create a certain mood, because what does music also do? It raises your frequency, it changes your frequency. And so it is a form of mental time travel. Sometimes I like to, and even it's like in the power of my imagination. It's like sometimes you hear a certain song and it really does take you back. It's like, oh, I remember, I heard this song, and, I remember, being in, like, for example, middle school. Oh, this takes me back to middle school. Or, because what does memory do? When you listen to a lot of music, especially like I do, especially like most people do, music can really jog certain memories. Oh, this came out when I was in high school, or I remember, this song came out, when, da 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 da. And so it really jogs the memory. So when you're listening to certain songs, it creates an energy. Different songs have different feelings, different energies. There's songs that make you really happy. There's songs that make you want to dance. There's songs that make you sad. There's songs that make you motivated. So I like to mentally time travel with the power of music. And since I'm talking about mental time travel, I don't know if some of y'all noticed, but I just have to mention this. Y'all like my MJ action figure, Michael Jordan, from the Space Jam? I just had to do that. I just had to do that. Anyway, technically that's actually my brother's. But anyway, back to focusing. See, mentally time travel, even things like that, even now that I brought that up, even if you still have, collector items, toys, even though, some people like to judge, oh, why do adults, you shouldn't be collecting toys, stuffed animals. I don't care. You can just judge me, or do whatever. I don't really care. But anyway, even with that being said, it can be, video games. Different things can make you mentally time travel. I think with music, because, most people like music, like most people listen to music, it is the most effective way to time travel. So, What is the most effective way to mentally time travel? How can you really get the benefits of doing this? So, when you mentally time travel, of course, when you do this, you should be trying to reflect on, positive memories, feel good memories, wholesome memories. You don't want to be thinking about, and this is especially helpful for people who may have a lot of negative thoughts or have trouble with negative memories bothering them. What you want to do is you want to try to reflect more on the positive memories. It can be happy memories, blissful memories, or what have you. And when you do this and you want to really focus, you want to visualize, try to remember the memory, as deeply as you want to. Try to really feel the music if you're listening to music as deeply as you want to. It's almost like when I and still talking about music, it's almost like sometimes when you really get into it, you want to really get into it, really listen. And sometimes when you focus very intently on like the music, it's almost like you do transport some type of way back into that era or back into that decade when you really focus on it. hmm And so, with that being said, really focus, really get into it. It really does create a certain energy and it really does create a certain frequency within your mind, within your body. So, mental time travel. So, we've discussed talking about music, and then you can, of course, you can reflect on certain memories. Some people, think of it as, if you're reflecting on past memories, think of how people get very nostalgic. They remember certain things. I remember there was a certain time, I would be looking at those commercials. It's funny because, especially nowadays, most time people don't want to be looking at commercials, skipping the ads on YouTube. With me, it's like sometimes I still really think about certain commercials from, growing up, when you're a child, especially, on the weekends, the commercials that come on. And it's like, who do we reminisce? Who do we remember back in the early 2000s? Billy Mays, for example, the OxyClean guy or whatever. Sometimes I was thinking about Billy Mays not too long ago. Or, those wholesome commercials, because the commercials nowadays really aren't what they used to be. It's like, they had a certain type of charm, growing up. It's like, then what was the other one? That Chef Boyardee commercial with the can rolling down the sidewalk or whatever, following that little girl home. It's like the wholesome memories of like the 2000s. And so I keep saying the 2000s because again, I am a child of the 2000s. I like to reminisce and mentally time travel. It's not when I mentally time travel, it's not like I'm sad, it's not, the 2000 anymore. It makes me sad. It makes me, no, I don't mean it in like that way. It's just something that kind of happens to me where it's like, you know what? I'm going to just mentally transport back into a very happy time in my life. I was a happy child, for the most part, even though I was going through something, in my childhood. But, for the most part, it was a good childhood. It wasn't necessarily the best, wasn't the worst. And so I like to mentally time travel. I like to remember, it could be, for example, certain shows you used to watch, certain cartoons you used to watch as a child, the classic cartoons, things of that nature. Whatever it is that you have to reflect, whatever it is that you remember in whatever decade you want to go back to, and mentally time travel. Mm. So, with that being said, now, you can mentally time travel and create a mood. So, what happens if, for example, back to the topic of music, what if you're listening to something that's before you were even born? Like, for example, if I'm listening to music, in the 90s or something, or before I was born, something with, if you really reflect and really listen intently to the music. Like, for example, I was born in 1997, but there's certain songs, I like songs from the 90s as well, especially like the early 90s. Even when I'm listening to songs that's, before I was even born, it's like something within me. It's like because the music, and I focus so intently with the music, it's like I can almost see myself in that era or in that decade. Even though I wasn't even born within that decade, or I'm listening to something before I was even born, something within me is like, oh, I can resonate with this era. I can resonate with this. And it's kind of like, oh, how can you resonate with something? How do you know about this? You weren't even born when this music came out. How do you know about da 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 da? I don't care. I don't really care. I still resonate with it. It's something with, because music is that powerful. It's really that powerful. And it's like, I'm listening to certain songs, and it's like, oh my goodness, what would it have been like to be in like the nightclub in the early 90s? Or, you're listening to certain romance songs or love songs, and it's like, oh my goodness, what, especially with certain, male groups from like the 90s, it was some really good music. You hear that and it's like, oh my goodness, what would dating be like? It's like it's almost like my mind is saying, take me back, even though I wasn't there. It's like mentally take me there, mentally place me there, so that I can experience it on a deeper level. hmm So, with that being said, when you do this and you're listening to something without, or excuse me, you're listening to something that's past your what you remember within your life, you can even still feel positive benefits. It's like, take me back energy, take me back to a different time. You hear a lot of older people talking about, it was a simpler time. Was it a simpler time? I wasn't there, but I can say, more than likely it probably was a simpler time, or it was a different time. Society changes throughout the decades. But with that being said, you want to mentally time travel. Really get into the music, really get into what you remember. And when you do this, it's almost like, what am I looking for? It's like you're transporting yourself again back in time. You don't need a time machine. It's not that you need a time machine. You may not be able to go back to a certain decade, but the music still exists. Certain clothes, we have certain thrift shops now. We have vintage shops. We have antique stores. There are ways for you to mentally time travel. You may not be able to physically go back in time the way you may want to. And we all have those moments where we want to go, oh, I wish I was back in my childhood. I wish I was back, like the 90s. I wish I was back, to like the 70s, da 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 da. Sometimes you do have those moments because it really was a different time period than it was today. But you can still mentally time travel. You can still reflect and reminisce. You can still create feelings of nostalgia. And there really isn't nothing wrong with that. And really, when you reflect and you time travel, mentally time travel back into the past, again, it shouldn't really make you sad. It's not really something to where, depending on your mindset, it really shouldn't make you sad. It should be like, you know what, I was glad I was able to experience this, growing up. I'm glad that, this music came out. I had certain memories. I was playing this music in my car, and I remember, wearing these cute outfits, with my jewelry and da 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 da. And even if you hear music, before or whatever it is that you're reminiscing on, before you were born. Some people feel like they're born in the wrong time period or what have you. Sometimes I get that feeling a little bit, but at least you can say in the present time, again, you can still listen to music from the past. You can explore whatever decade, with the power of internet and technology, and even like things that they still sell, like, records and CDs. You can collect those items. You can expose yourself to different genres, to different musicians, and you can just transport, and that's the beauty of it. With all of it, and I know I keep staying on music because it's just the easiest example that I have for mental time travel, but we have so much diversity within music. You can mentally transport and mentally time travel to whatever you want to go to, because we have that diversity, so many genres, different musicians, a wide range of what you can mentally time travel to. So, with that being said, you can even take it further, and I'm going to use back to an example of like music, before you were like born or what have you. Again, if you really focus intently on the music and you really get into it, like for example, you just get a song or a record or whatever it is, and you just like, ooh, this is some good music, and oh, I'm really liking this new artist, this new record that I've gotten, and da 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 da. Really, I'm just really into this, and if you really get into the music, you can almost visualize, because all music is frequency, all is frequency. If you really get into it, like I've heard certain songs, that I have a record player, so I've been collecting records. When I really get into it, I may get up and start dancing like I've mentally transported into, again, like a nightclub. But not necessarily a nightclub, just any type of club, with some good music. And it's like I'm mentally somewhere, just dancing, enjoying myself, whether it's by myself or I mentally feel like I'm with like a nice, handsome man or something, and I'm just really into it. It's the power of music. It really is powerful. So when you do it correctly, when it really raises your frequency correctly and you really mentally get into it, that's kind of how it's supposed to feel. It's supposed to feel like you basically went back in time and you're actually there. It's something with the power of frequency. Because again, music is really that powerful. hmm So, with that being said, and I really should do a separate video on the spirituality of music, because I can do a whole topic basically on that as well. But basically, that's basically how it's supposed to feel when you mentally time travel. So, it's basically whatever it is you want to remember. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily be music, that's just the easiest example that I have. Again, it could be, TV shows. It can be, you just remember certain imagery. What was it in the 2000s that they're calling it now? Excuse me, I can't get it out. Let me try it again. Frutiger Arrow. I think I butchered that, but with that visuals, it's like the greenery with like the technology and stuff. Yeah, I need to pull up an example of a picture, but I'm pretty sure you've seen it online. Anything that's going to mentally take you back, certain commercials. It's whatever is going to mentally time travel. And it really is a powerful form of transmutation. So, do what it is you need to do to mentally time travel and experience the positive emotions that you really feel. And sometimes, especially, this day and age, we have so much going on in the news, people stressed out with their jobs. We have a lot of inflation. At the time of this video, gas prices are like out of control. Sometimes you just have to de stress by mentally time travel. It really is beneficial, and it really is good stress relief. So, that's all I had for this one in mentally time travel. And so, I'll come with you in the next one, and I'll check you later. Bye!